The funding situation has continued to get worse and worse. It feels a bit like policing 10 years ago, where the police had their funding cut and the government said, but the crime rates aren't going up, so you can obviously have it cut more.
What would you say are some of the biggest stresses that teachers are facing in their day-to-day work at the moment?
So when people are saying behaviour is getting worse, it actually is, but in part it looks like because it got better.
Are there other things that stand out in your mind and thought, that is not what we were expecting at all?
When that happens, you will see a contraction of schools closing, and you need fewer teachers. School leaders over the last 5 years have done extraordinary things. They have gone to extraordinary lengths. I mean, we have the data to prove the stress they were under, the difficulties they faced. The government largely didn't help them, and they did it with an enormous amount of determination, and I think they should hold their heads up high. If you have good colleagues around you who make you feel supported and part of a team, that can make you feel more committed to your job and much happier.
Welcome to Trust Matters Lessons in Leadership, the podcast where we explore the stories, insights, and ideas shaping the future of schools and trusts. Today's guest is Laura McInerney, a former teacher, education journalist, policy expert, and co-founder of Teacher Tapp, the daily survey app used by over 10,000 teachers. Laura began her career in East London classrooms before she went on to become editor of Schools Week and a columnist for The Guardian. With Teacher Tapp, she's helping cut through the noise to share what's really happening in our schools today. In this episode, we dive into the data on workload, behaviour, retention, and well-being. We take a look at what it reveals, what policymakers might be missing, and what could truly improve the working lives of teachers. Welcome to the podcast, Laura. So pleased to have you on today. We like to start by thinking about, the journey, where you've come from and reflecting on that. So you've had quite a unique journey, I would say. You had a background in teaching in East London, then journalism, then founding Teacher Tapp. When you look back now, what are some of those standout moments or key experiences that you say would shape where you're at today?
So I think most people don't escape their own schooling. So as much as my career is all kind of built up to this point, actually, like most people, I think the fact that I went to what I always call like a deeply ordinary state comprehensive, I feel like I had almost a bang average childhood in that I was from a very ordinary family in a very ordinary small town at a very ordinary secondary school. And from that, I've been able to have some flexibility, I think, to having been in a school where there was lots of people who maybe had a more difficult time, from poorer communities, to being around people who were also wealthier or found it much easier at school. And all of that has certainly influenced how I think about schools as a very big sector with lots of diversity. And then, I love teaching. I love being in schools. I think even if I'd never been a teacher, I'd have always loved being in schools because I liked school. That helps as well. It leaves you with positive memories. The fact that I wasn't a very good teacher when I started, I found it very difficult. People sometimes think I must have been this natural teacher, but I really wasn't. Thank goodness for my teacher training, because those people, plus my colleagues, plus the pupils and their patients, is what added up to me becoming a decent teacher by the end. So I think the experiences of school and teaching in school were probably the most formative for how I think about education. But I've also just been lucky with lots of people since then helping out.
And then when it came to founding Teacher Tapp, what was the reason that you set that up, and why did you feel like teachers' voices weren't being heard in the right way?
So in 2017, I was the editor of Schools Week at that point in time, and very good friends with Professor Becky Allen, who was doing research over at the Institute of Education. And she was working on a variety of research projects, had been given this funding to come up with a regular survey of what was actually supposed to be trainee teachers to start with, in part because the government had stopped surveying teachers. It'd become very, very difficult. And increasingly now, actually, the Office for National Statistics is in all kinds of trouble with all kinds of statistics, because it's really hard to get people to respond to things, especially through old methods, knocking on doors, people aren't home, and so on. So in 2017, she wanted to do these surveys for trainee teachers. But of course, I was writing every week these editorials and feeling like an average person in touch with teachers. I'm saying teachers think this, teachers think that. But honestly, there are 500,000 teachers. And even if you speak to loads and loads of them, you're not really going to get the full picture in a week. Even if I spoke to, 100 teachers, there's still thousands, hundreds of thousands you haven't spoken to. So I said to her, look, is there any chance that this survey app that you're coming up with, you could survey all teachers on a range of different topics, and then I can write about it in my editorials. And I, like everybody else, will be held to account for what I say teachers think. Because until then, until Teacher Tapp came in, politicians could say, I've spoken to these teachers, or I believe teachers think this. And someone on the other side, the unions might say, well, we think teachers say this. But actually, no one had a holistic view. And as much as in a newspaper, you try and find the truth, or you try and find representative people, getting that unfiltered voice day by day, right in the moment, felt exciting. And apps had just come in. It was the first time you could do something like this. And so Becky, to her credit, said, sure, let's try that, but you have to come and help me build it. And I, in obviously a moment of weakness, said, yeah, sure. How hard can that be? And nearly 8 years later now, we find ourselves with over 10,000 teachers answering every day, running this organization that helps in lots of different countries now and doing lots of different policy work. So it's really, it kind of went out of control.
Incredible, though. I mean, you probably wouldn't realise where you'd get to now looking back at 2017. And how do you think it's changed you personally, and as someone who's a thought leader in the sector, having this insight into the data?
In truth, I think the way it's changed me personally is that I have a responsibility for an organisation, right? And so it's always interesting when I look at academy leaders and school leaders, and people want them to talk about what they're going through, what they've learned. Obviously, you do that on this podcast. It's actually quite hard when you run something. There's lots of different layers of things that are going on. And I would like to say that I was sympathetic to that previously in various jobs, including at Schools Week, but I'm obviously a bit more sympathetic to that now, how hard it is to run things, to employ people, to ensure you've got enough funds. So I think that's probably how I've changed personally over time. And that can sometimes make it a bit harder when you're a punchy commentator. I look back 10, 11 years ago, and one of the reasons I was well liked in the journalism work that I did is that I was quite elbows forward, quite bolshy, said it as it was. And I still try to do that because I believe in being straightforwards. But over time, definitely some of the corners have been knocked off. I've got more empathy. And that makes it harder to be sharp with people. And so over time in a career, especially in commentating, I think people often either double down, they become sharper, they say, no, I'm going to become more and more extreme, or they often bland out a bit. And I think I've probably blanded out a little bit. There might be some people listening thinking, oh, I remember when Laura was much punchier and harsher and I want her to stick it to people. And I've maybe lost a little bit of that. I don't know, but that's honestly how I think I've changed.
Well, you have been described as fearless a few times. I'm sure there's a lot of people in the sector who know you and know your story and would say that you have been fearless. I mean, you took the government to court. I mean...
No, I was going to... They took me to court. It was the other way around. I didn't take them, but I turned up.
You represented yourself.
I did. I turned up and I wouldn't back down.
Yeah, and you wouldn't back down, and you saw that all the way through.
Yeah.
And what would you say drives you in those moments? Is it confidence, or is it just doing the right thing for the right people in that moment?
The fearless thing, I think, comes both from the court case and from the fact that I did head a newspaper in my early 30s for 3 years, in which we did some very punchy front pages. And that did mean having to have difficult conversations, upsetting people, sometimes people not being very happy with the facts as presented. And you have to have a certain level of steeliness to support your team, who have gone through all of the right processes to put that information forwards. And I can tell you, there was no story that ever went in that newspaper that hadn't had an enormous amount of care, that I hadn't thought about deeply whether or not it needed to be in the paper and it needed to be said. But I'm not fearless. And so I always find it funny when people say that. And also, they sometimes say, you don't care, you do this stuff. I would say I care an enormous amount. It's the fact that I care so much that means when push comes to shove, I'm willing to stand up for myself because I know that I will have thought it through. If I thought there was any chink in the armour, I will have checked it. And so I'm only putting myself in those positions when I feel pretty strongly like we are in the right place for us and for what we need to represent. So I think there's that. And then there is this issue of me having a slight streak where I don't like what I perceive as injustice. Now, Lots of people have that, actually, and it gets talked about sometimes these days as a certain characteristic or a certain trait. But most children have a sense of unfairness or injustice. I think mine is overdeveloped sometimes. And then on top of it, there's this weird thing of like, I have to do something. And so I've always found it very challenging. Even as a kid, I found it hard to stand back. So famously, when we were in year 8 at school, a lad was getting beaten up by a bunch of boys from year 11. And I jumped in to try and stop them. And of course, the year 11 boys rounded on me, and it didn't end particularly well over the next few months as those guys continued to have a bit of a go at me. But I just couldn't hold back. And actually, the year 8 boy didn't much thank me for it. His view was I'd gone in and embarrassed him in front of everybody because he was saved by a girl. But I've always struggled with that. As a teacher, I had to learn sometimes to hold back on it. I got my ribs broken. Again, going into a fight to try and get a kid out. Didn't know how to do it properly. Didn't use my head. Got some broken ribs. And I had to really learn. And it's something that even now I still have to, in those emotive moments, think to myself, actually, am I doing the right thing? What's a sensible strategy here? And I've probably, again, learned to calm down and step back. But most people who are in education, I think, feel some sense of emotional mission. And that's what drives me in those moments. Usually I feel determined because there's an injustice.
Yeah, and like you say, I think teachers have, a love for the job, a love for caring for the people around them and doing the right thing, because like you say, most people wouldn't be in the profession if those weren't the things that were driving them. And when you look back on that early career teacher, the one who was jumping in, getting the ribs broken, what would your advice be, like with all your experience now and everything you know about the sector and about teachers in particular? When you look back, what would be your one piece of advice for you in that position as an early career teacher?
Jump back when the fists are swinging at you. It's difficult, the question of what advice would you give to your younger self, because most of the things that you could avoid, even the broken ribs, I wouldn't actually want me to avoid. I think if I told myself, try and avoid these things, I'd either not listen, I'd panic unnecessarily, and I wouldn't learn lessons that have probably held me in good stead going forwards. So if I had to give my younger self a piece of advice, it would actually be, one day you're going to be at an awards dinner and you don't think you're going to win. And actually, I'd probably prefer to tell myself this in some way where I don't tell you that I win the award, but it's material. And just as you take a bite of the most delicious dessert you've ever eaten, you win the award. And by the time you get back, that dessert will be gone and you will think about it for the next 20 years. And the thing is, I could eat that dessert and not change the timeline, but I wouldn't regret it. So I think my advice would be, one day you'll be handed a lemon posset. Do not let it out of your hands. Take it on the stage if you need to.
Because you're never seeing it again.
Because you'll never see it again, and you will spend the next 25 years trying to find that lemon posset. But other than that, everything else that I've gone through, all the pain, except for that, I would go through again.
Yeah, because it makes you who you are today, doesn't it? Like, sliding doors and everything, isn't it? If you change one thing, it would change where you are now today. And you learn a lot of lessons from your mistakes and things that happen.
Yeah, and my instinct is to think of things where I might have hurt or upset people unintentionally and undo those. But I have also had to learn to apologise and to make things right and to accept that I won't always get stuff right. Which is hard. And it's something that when I talk with school leaders a lot, I can see sits on their shoulders, particularly during the pandemic. So many of them made decisions they didn't know if it was the right one or the wrong one, or it became obvious it was the wrong one. You have to live with that.
Yeah.
And that's learning to live with that is important.
This podcast is brought to you by The Key. Help your team thrive this term and every term after when you join the 17,000 schools who are already leaning on our trusted support. With everything from need to knows and fact sheets to interactive tools and live leadership classes, we support your whole team to make an impact and navigate the challenges that you face right now. Get immediate access to the comprehensive support your team deserves when you become a whole school member today. Visit thekeysupport.com to find out more. And the sector is constantly changing. I mean, the pace of change is incredible. What would you say are some of the things that have changed the most since you founded Teacher Tapp, and where do you see the sector heading? Although you haven't got a crystal ball, I know it's hard with a sector that changes so much.
So when we started Teacher Tapp in 2017, funding was already tight. Other public services were already falling by the wayside. And I would say that workload was already very high. Actually, at that time, we'd had quite a lot of national curriculum change and the GCSEs were changing. So we were moving to the 9-1 grades. So that felt like an enormous workload. Over the last 7 years, because there hasn't been that much change in terms of the curriculum and assessments other than the pandemic parts, actually we've seen that workload reduce. But the funding situation has continued to get worse and worse. Secondaries have been a little protected because they've had higher numbers, but certainly in primary it's getting worse. And I do worry going forwards from here that it feels a bit like policing 10 years ago, where the police had their funding cut and the government said, but the crime rates aren't going up. So you can obviously have it cut more. And now I feel like across the country, people really see what happens when you cut funding that much. And I'm slightly worried that we're going to see schools ending up having to continue to cut away. And what that does is it removes the small joys. It removes the ability to go on trips. It removes nice decoration. It removes extracurricular. It removes the opportunity to go and do professional development. It reduces the quality of the stationery. It reduces the quality of the food. All of those small cuts just make it feel less welcoming compared to 2017. But also, I know that teachers have incredible spirits and work around these things, and so they continue to make it feel as warm as it can. But I think that's probably the biggest shift between 2017 and now. And then there are the challenges around students, particularly in primary, who came into the world during the pandemic. And we don't know yet how that's going to work out, but certainly the signs might be it'll be a bit trickier to bring that group through primary school.
Yeah, most definitely. I think we're hearing that a lot around early years at the moment, things around that. And you've studied education, like you said before, you're a bit of a nerd when it comes to education policy and education secretaries, which I think is incredible, the wealth of knowledge you have around this. And I think it would be good for you to share some of it. So you've studied all of that. What are some of the things that you learned looking at that over decades and you wish policymakers would remember? Because things happen and patterns occur. And what are some of those main things you think, come on, this happened 10 years ago and we're doing it all again?
I mean, I wish it was 10 years ago. Sometimes I look at things from sort of 140 years ago and you think, really? One of the extraordinary ones has been performance-related pay. So performance-related pay came back in again about 10 or 15 years ago. It's actually just dropped back off the agenda again. And of course, this was something that was tried over 100 years ago. It didn't go particularly well then. And it's not that you shouldn't retry things. Actually, there are some things I'd like us to bring back when we've got new technologies, but you have to work out why they went wrong the first time. So performance-related pay is always very challenging in schools because it's actually a team game and it's very hard to work out which teacher is impacting which children in which way, and then you get into all kinds of trouble. Also, there's not more money. So it's not as if a school suddenly has its results go up, they have a ton more cash. It doesn't work like profits work. So that's one of them. There's the fact that pupil numbers have sort of gone on this big cycle since the baby boom. So every roughly 25 years or so, we have some kids, there's more and then there's fewer, and we open schools and then we close schools, and we seem to panic. In 2010, we're all like, what? Why is there loads of children? Quick, open primary schools. And now we're all like, what? Why are there no children? Quick, close all the schools. Actually, that's something that we can just see has happened now for a really long time, about 80 years. So we should just remember that and think about it each time. But curriculum wars are fascinating. You can go all the way back to when we had knights, literally on horses galloping around with jousting sticks. And there's this big debate about, does a knight need to spend his time jousting, or does he need to spend his time learning poetry and sort of understanding the academic things and be a better person? So some of the debates I find a little esoteric and endless. Some of them I think we could probably solve a bit better. But in any case, having some knowledge of this is both fun and quite useful. So if you ever think to yourself, we're facing a tough problem in education, it's worth having a quick Google, see if anybody else has dealt with it before.
Probably not the first time.
Almost inevitably not the first time. And if last time they didn't deal with it successfully, at least you can learn from their mistakes.
Exactly that. And you hinted there about the population and what we're seeing with pupil numbers falling. I think at the moment we're at a weird place because you constantly hear about the recruitment and retention crisis, but we're also starting to see an oversupply in some areas of teachers. Could you just explain to our listeners what is actually happening there and where you think this is going to head in the next year or so?
We've had oversupply in teaching before, actually. So again, just to put this into perspective, when I came into teaching, it was 2006. And at that time, London had a really deep teacher shortage. Like, you just couldn't find them for love nor money in secondary schools and a little bit in primary schools. But where I'm from in the Northwest, primary school teachers were 10 a penny. Like, it was hard to get jobs. And so some of my friends who wanted to be primary school teachers out of university actually struggled at that time and ended up not going into the profession. Now, 2006 in population terms looks a bit like what's happening now. It was a time when the pupil numbers were quite reduced. We didn't yet have the baby boom of 2010. And so Labour, who were in government, were closing schools. And so actually you might have ended up, even though you had a job, losing your job. We're in a position now where we've got quite a large group in the secondary schools. They're going to work their way through. And in primary, the numbers have dropped because the birth rate has dropped. There has been immigration at reasonably high rates over the last couple of years, so that will play into it, and we're still not entirely sure how, so that might pick it up a little bit. But actually, the immigration groups this time are looking quite different than previously. But it means that overall, we're probably going to have fewer pupils in our schools over the next 10 years. And when that happens, you will see a contraction of schools closing, and you need fewer teachers. Now, it may be that more people leave. And that generally happens when the economy is very good, but we don't have a very good economy. So actually, this year in our recruitment and retention report, we've seen many fewer adverts than during the pandemic. It's looking more like 2018, 2019. And we might expect that actually you'll have even fewer going forwards, especially if the unemployment rates continue to stay high. So what you could end up with over the next 4 years is a situation where you've got more teachers staying, less movement in the market, less need for new teachers, and then it will all come down to how many people want to be teachers. If suddenly everybody exits or loads and loads carry on going to Dubai or elsewhere, then it might just even out. Or you could end up with pockets of oversupply, and generally in the past they have been more likely in primary, more in areas of the country where there are fewer jobs available. So for example, the Northwest, more likely to end up with oversupply than somewhere like, in the past, London. And especially as London gets very expensive again, which was what had happened in the early 2000s, you have a lot of flight from the city, you can end up with some parts of the country absolutely scrabbling to get somebody, while other places have got too many teachers.
So interesting. I feel it's really good to paint the picture of that, because I think there's a lot of confusion at the moment around what's really happening in the sector. And is there anything else along those lines that you think people aren't really paying attention to yet, but is going to have a big impact over the next 5 years?
I mean, I think people on the ground are generally paying attention. So I would say that the school leaders, the academy leaders do know it. The policymakers tend to be the ones that we have to kind of drag along. Exactly. They need to hear it for a really long time before they'll believe it or respond. But it's not just teacher recruitment. Actually, I would say the bigger issue is other people recruitment, including learning support assistants, receptionists, librarians, those kind of roles, particularly because of the increased flexibility in the retail sector, in the home working sector. Because the minimum wage has increased, it's brought a lot more jobs in line. And actually, if you can get the same amount of money working in a job with full flexibility, where you can do extra hours where you need to without as much responsibility, frankly, then you may well choose to go and do that. And so I think the bigger issue in some places is that wider recruitment. Beyond that, in terms of trends, the one that everyone is talking about is special educational needs. I think the government are aware of it. And actually, I think the sector is starting to sort out solutions. We're hearing a lot more schools coming up with resource provision, a lot more of a view that if schools were given the funds that are currently going outwards to the private sector to try and resolve some of these issues, they could do it. But they need the buildings, they need the people, they need the time to do the training. But all of that is sort of on the ground hopeful. And I keep speaking to a variety of local authorities, school improvement partners who are doing really great stuff in this space. And I'm hoping that the policymakers will kind of catch up and start to say, right, we can see this great pocket of practice. We want to spread that out elsewhere. But they're very, very slow.
We've seen that. Very slow.
Yeah, and I think it's because of funding.
Yeah.
It's the shift in money that goes now to special educational needs is huge. Like it's gone up enormously in the last 10 to 15 years. And no one really wants to talk about it because they don't have more money and they feel like solutions require more money. But what's clever is I think the sector are now saying maybe we just need to put that money in different places.
Yeah.
And actually help us to do that. But that's always hard.
And one of the things you touched on there was flexible and hybrid working in the private sector. Obviously, post-COVID, that's become a massive thing. Do you think teaching is still an attractive profession to those people maybe leaving university who have the option of going to the private sector, doing hybrid work and flexible working, and they don't have that option in the teaching profession? And also, what are you hearing from teachers on the ground about, do they want flexible working, and how is it working successfully for those who can do it?
Yeah, when we survey on this, it is massively popular. I find it kind of difficult, actually. So this is one of those examples where I have a personal view, and then how people feel about it is very different, which is why Teacher Tapp matters so much, because I did a job out of university, which was one of the big four big four firms. I worked in consulting. I actually got to work from home at that point in time. I was working away and traveling and working on, the fancy new internet at the time. And I didn't like it. And one of the reasons I came into school was because actually I wanted a community. I wanted to go somewhere every day. I wanted the intense 6 weeks and then time off, and not to feel like it was all sort of petering into my life. But that isn't what most people say. If you ask most people their preferred amount of time working, they would say 4 days per week. It's very, very popular. We can see from the 9-day fortnight media coverage, the amount that people talk about it. Again, when we talk about it, people are very motivated by the idea that 1 day a fortnight they could work from home for all kinds of reasons. And it may be that they also think they could do their work on a weekend and then have that day to do other stuff. Because one of your problems as a teacher is all of your holidays are when everybody is off. So you never get a day when you can go to the hairdressers when it's quiet or have a weekend away. Whereas actually, if you had that day on a Friday every now and then, you would be able to have those long weekends, or you might be able to go to the shopping centre when it's not packed full of people. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so compelling. But I also think we have to be realistic that the job is community-based, people-based, relational-based. And I think it's a strength. Increasingly, we're also seeing young people saying that working from home isn't always great for them. They're not learning from people. They want friends. They want to have that kind of community. And I think schools should lean into the fact that they offer that.
Yeah.
If they can do that with a bit of extra flexibility, it will help. Ways to do that. It looks like those schools that are giving more flexibility are rethinking form time in secondary school. Actually, that captures an enormous amount of teach time each day. So 20 minutes in the morning to do registration. Could that be done slightly differently is a good question. And also in primary, more job shares and more part-time working, which has actually always been quite common. About 23%, I think, of our primary teach tappers are in part-time work anyway. So they don't work full-time.
That's really interesting. And from the Teacher Tapp data, what would you say are some of the biggest stresses that teachers are facing in their day-to-day work at the moment?
Behaviour and special educational needs are the ones that come up a lot. Behaviour is an interesting one. So we've tracked it from before the pandemic. We started asking on a Friday afternoon if your lesson has been interrupted. So teaching and learning has stopped due to behaviour. And that's always been quite high, actually. If you're a new teacher, it's really high. I think it's over half of teachers on any given Friday will say their lesson has been stopped. On average, it's somewhere between kind of 25 and 40%, depending on the time of year. And a few other variables. Actually, in the pandemic, behaviour got a little bit better. People didn't recognise it because they were so busy trying to work out everything else, sanitising their hands and staying a metre away from a child and dealing with everything that came with the pandemic. But because there were fewer children they were often in bubbles and they were more tightly controlled, fewer lessons seemed to get disrupted. So since the pandemic, that's gone back to the pre-pandemic levels. When people are saying behaviour is getting worse, it actually is, but in part it looks like because it got better.
Yeah.
But behaviour certainly has ticked back to a norm. In secondary, it seems to be holding up okay, but in primary, it does seem that it's going much worse. Now, people will often say, well, that's only perception. You're only ever measuring teachers' perceptions of that particular day. And that's true, but I've no reason to believe that at 3:30, if I ask you about something that happened an hour ago, that in 2017, you'd have a massively different perception than you would have now. We're not asking, is it worse? We're literally just asking, did this thing happen? And we sometimes ask about how many minutes or what actually happened. So it's possible that it's just people are more tired, they're less tolerant. But for that particular question, I think we've got pretty good evidence that something in primary is looking quite different. And in secondary, it's gone back to a norm. And then you do have an increased number of children with diagnosed special educational needs, which then come with additional needs and additional things that teachers need to do. And teachers aren't always trained to do that. Of course, we have to remember as well that a bunch of teachers were trained during the pandemic. So people who are in their first 5 years of their career, some of them were trained during the pandemic years. Those who weren't but have come afterwards were being educated during the pandemic years. And we're now starting to see come through those who had their A-levels incredibly disrupted. So, the group that are coming through have had a very weird educational experience. And as I said before, your education does influence how you feel about things, what you've seen as normal. And so as a sector, we've just got to grapple with that. Things are going to be a little bit different for a little while. And we're going to have to work on that.
I think that's the first time I've heard someone not talk about the impact of the pandemic on pupils, but actually the workforce. Then that's really true. I'd not thought about that. The people coming through the workforce, all of their education was disrupted by the pandemic as well. So you're going to have this like crossover of pupils who were born in the pandemic, who obviously have socialization difficulties, issues, or things to overcome. And then the people teaching them were also impacted in some of their really key years in A-levels in uni by the pandemic. And the crossover of that will be really interesting to see, like how that all comes out.
Yeah. And in another, I would say maybe 15 to 20 years, what will be even more interesting is when that crowd who were at school when the pandemic happened and at university when the pandemic happened will start to become the policymakers and leaders of tomorrow. And what we know all through history is that people want to resolve the issues of their own childhood or of what they've seen and what they've experienced. For a very long time, we've had backwards and forwards about grammar schools, often because people were themselves at a grammar school that became a comprehensive or got in or didn't got in or anything else. And as that group have kind of gone away, what you've had is this rise now of people who came through, like me, the Labour years and actually saw things get a lot better and really believed in social mobility and saw universities get better. So our battle is generally now this idea of should everyone go to university or not? Well, how, I wouldn't want that taken away from other people when I got that. And so that I think is going to go through for the next 10 or 15 years. And then you're going to get this crowd whose exams were cancelled. And I think that will matter. They will have views on assessment. They will have views on whether exams are good or bad, strongly in either direction, depending on their experiences. And I wouldn't be surprised in 15 or 20 years' time if assessment and changes to our exam systems come back on the table.
We'll have to come back to this episode and refer back to you when we all see that
I'm either
out.
a super forecaster or I absolutely get everything wrong. That's the problem with having everything on record over time.
And we spoke about, obviously, the flexibility, workload, behaviour, but another thing that plays a big part in like teaching and work life is the relationships you have with other people who work with you. How do teachers report on that? Like, do most of the, like in the data, are you seeing that most people are comfortable with the people that they work with? Are they enjoying the social side? Like, is that still a thing post-pandemic? People socialising with other teachers outside of work? And what difference does that make to the people you see that stay in the profession?
Yeah, so we have seen it drop a little post-pandemic. That is true. But I actually think that's true across society more broadly. And it does make a difference. In the big polling, Gallup polling companies, one of the things they talk about is the fact that having a best friend at work is predictive of whether or not you'll stay in your job. So having colleagues matters. Certainly one of the things we studied and found out is we looked at morale. So we surveyed teachers about the morale in their school. And then we separated out people who said it was high and people who said it was low. And we asked why morale was the way that it was in their schools. When we analyse all of the words from the people in the low morale schools, the two words that come up the most often are behaviour and workload. Not at all surprising. Next set of words are all quantity words. Much, lots, too much, And so I thought when we went to the high morale, what we were going to find was the same thing, behaviour and workload, but there would be, good behaviour and workload is fine. And that's not true. That's not what happened, which when I thought about it afterwards makes sense because everybody has workload. Everybody deals with behaviour, frankly. What we found there was the two words that stood out were team and supportive. And a set of quality words, kind of, they trusted them, they respected them, they get, there's this sense of being looked after. And what that tells you is that schools are challenging places. There's no doubt about it. You're probably not going to get through life without any behaviour problems or thinking that you've got too much marking. But If you have good colleagues around you who make you feel supported and part of a team, that can make you feel more committed to your job and much happier. Whereas people who talk about low morale are more likely to want to leave the job. Now, that's really, really hard. You can't make that happen, right? But I do sometimes say to leaders, think through when you are recruiting people, the balance in your team, how people are going to get on. Do you have some people in your school who are the radiators, as Tim Brighouse would talk about them? They bring the warmth. They think about whether it's somebody's birthday. They take them a Jaffa cake and a cup of tea if they're crying because their students have been dreadful. That was me a lot. That matters. That really, really matters, because for every person who's very serious and learning and doing super well and doing great lessons, if they're also being not very nice or pleasant to other people, then you've got to have a counteracting effect.
And in the data, have you found anything surprising or counterintuitive about why people stay or leave the profession?
We've actually got a big analysis, discrete choice paper, which we did earlier this year, where we've got people to trade off looking at job adverts. And I can't give anything away on that at the moment. So
We'll have to wait for that one.
Yeah, wait. And I think it's going to be really, really interesting when some of those findings come out. Again, like many times in Teacher Tapp, I was surprised by the answers.
Looking for more tailored support for you and your trust? Stay ahead with Trust Matters, our monthly newsletter packed with the latest trust-specific news, upcoming events, and exclusive resources from the Key. It's your go-to resource for staying informed and inspired. Hit the link in the description below to subscribe today. And I know you can't say about that specific research, but is at the moment, from the Teacher Tapp data that you've had over the last 8 years, is there one reason why people say they leave? Like, is there one standout thing for the moment that people leave, or is there not really a clear reason?
Because we can only look at people who are in the profession. We don't necessarily always get to know why people are leaving. We do get some data when people say they're thinking of leaving and so on. And I think it's very, very varied. Also, when people say something like workload, I'm leaving because of workload, that word means a lot of different things. It could mean that my commute is too long, and therefore I just can't drive 50 minutes on top of a long day and then 50 minutes home and then sit and mark my books. It could mean that the pressure was too high. It could be that they didn't like the lesson mix that they do. One thing it isn't, we started Teacher Tapp because we thought that how many classrooms you taught in would make a difference. Becky and I, both having had years in teaching where we taught in lots of classrooms and found it absolutely exhausting. And it turned out it wasn't true. So we spent a whole year at the beginning of Teacher Tapp building this entire research project to prove ourselves true. And we were wrong. So that one is one that doesn't make a difference. I can tell you that at least.
And over the last 8 years, I mean, you literally have endless data, but are there kind of 3 things that stand out as some of the most surprising? Obviously, that was one of them. You thought one thing, you spent a year going towards that, and it was turned out to be something different. Are there other things that stand out in your mind and thought that is not what we were expecting at all?
So it's not what I wasn't expecting at all, but one that stands out because the difference was much bigger than I expected was when we asked people about if they expected to be a head teacher one day. And I think it's about, off the top of my head, about a quarter of male primary school teachers expect to be a head teacher one day. And amongst secondary females, it's something like, I think it's 8% or maybe even 5%. It's much lower. I think it's 5%. Now that's huge. That's a massive difference. And even between primary men and women, it was about half the rate. And Women Ed had asked us to do this at the time because we knew there probably was a difference in confidence levels. We also looked at how much more likely men were to ask for pay rises in those situations, much higher. But I just don't think I was ready for how different those numbers are and what that probably means just in terms of how people are feeling about their job, their level of agency, their autonomy, whether they'll get taken seriously, and how much you have to do if you want to solve that. Some people would say we shouldn't solve it, but that's massive. So that would be one. The other one that's always made me laugh is how many people mark in front of the television in the evening Although these days we have to put streamers on as well. So people are like, I don't have a television. But it's about 40 to 45% on any given night that people are marking in front of the TV. And that number, again, is much higher if you are female with children in primary school, much lower if you are male secondary without children. And it just goes to show you how different the job is. Doesn't mean it's good, doesn't mean it's bad. It is a job that enables you to be flexible and to do stuff. But I do wonder if people are sitting most nights of the week in front of the television doing extra work, does that end up adding up? Does it feel like a lot of pressure on their family? So that would be the second one. And then the third one is that more teachers like coffee than tea in the staff room. I mean, why?
That's interesting.
Yeah, why? Especially if it's instant coffee. Every year, more people pick coffee. So my co-founder, Becky, would say they're correct. So in fairness, she wins that one each year. But me, I'm just horrified by the loss of tea as the supreme thing in England.
Know what? I think that's a wider culture thing, because every time I walk around London, there's another coffee shop popping up. So I think that's a whole, that could be an interesting data point, like the hype of coffee versus tea.
It is. I mean, we have that data. We also do still need to come back to milk gates, because we've heard there is an increasing issue around what milk does your school provide or not provide. And in fact, just that question of does your school provide free tea and coffee is one of the most controversial that we ever ask. Just over half do provide free tea and coffee, but it means just over half don't. And then when people find out that the other half get it, what do you do? That's the real power of Teacher Tapp. Everybody learning about the important things on the ground.
We have a group on Facebook with primary school leaders. There's 40,000 primary school leaders, and the amount of times that debate comes up around whether your school provides free tea or coffee. But it is those things that make a difference. When you talk about like the wrap around, the support, the care, like those things do make a difference. I know like we joke, but I think they do, to people to feel like they're cared about. And those are the little things. But again, when it comes to money and resource, it's not always the thing that goes.
It's not, but I was fortunate enough to write a book with Professor Toby Salt, who was CEO of Ormiston at one point, the Academy Trust, and then went on to be in charge of AQA. And he kind of downloaded his entire career, and then we rewrote it out. And one bit in that book, a whole chapter, is about budgeting and what it is when you've got to make cuts across a big organisation. And he talks about the problem of salami slicing. And he says the thing is, anything like tea and coffee is giving you very little, whereas actually the tough choices around staff are what make the big differences. But people don't want to make those because they're human. So what they will do is they will try and winnow away. But to go back to that point about joy at the beginning, when you winnow away the joy, you are actually affecting all of your staff. And so he sort of encourages people to, really breathe in and figure out what are the big differences, and also to never cut food.
Never food. Do not touch food.
Yes, don't mess about with food.
You don't want
mess
hangry
about
people.
With energy bills. Put solar panel, like whatever you can do on any kind of utility bill, no one will notice. But they will notice if you reduce the quality of the sandwiches.
Definitely. And
it's good advice.
Yeah, it definitely is good advice. And apart from not cutting sandwiches and thinking about tea and coffee, what's one like raw, unfiltered message you'd give policymakers and maybe leaders who sit that bit more above, that aren't as in touch with in-ground teachers, about what it is teachers need at the moment and what they really care about?
Whenever there's a new education secretary, we ask people, what would you like them to know? And there's lots of different things they say. More swearing than I would expect. But the tenor is generally, please understand that we like our job, we care about it, listen to us, trust us, we want to work with you to make this happen. And policymakers, for whatever reason, sometimes get very dug down into the idea that the teachers aren't like that somehow they're actually just complaining, or they're moaning, or they're badly motivated. And I just don't think that's ever true. And I think if you find yourself thinking that, you have to take a step back and think, let's imagine everybody's on our side and everybody's very positive. How would we act? And act like that. Now, I don't see it very often in schools where this happens for school leaders, because by and large, when you survey, most people think their school leaders are really great. Most school leaders do a fantastic job. But every now and then, especially if they've gone through something difficult, I think leaders do get themselves into a bit of a hole where they start to feel that their staff are against them, that they're not interested, that they don't care. And I suspect if you surveyed their staff, as we sometimes do on school surveys, like actually what you'll see is that the majority of them feel the same way. We're here, we care, we just want you to help us to do a good job. Please treat us positively and get back online with that. And it's so hard when you are in some of these standoffs and you've tried to do things and they've not worked. But I just think good faith goes a long way with kids in classrooms, goes a long way with staff, and goes a long way with policymakers. You have to act as if everybody is on the kind of the right path together. Almost nobody comes into teaching with bad faith views, right? Like everyone is here to try and do best by the kids without wrecking their entire life, burning out, and that's the balance.
And speaking of delivering messages to the education sec, Bridget Phillipson, what would you say is the general consensus at the moment? I know we're in a period of consultations around Offstead, the curriculum. What would you say the general consensus on the ground is about the job that the Labour government are currently doing?
I mean, I think people are starting to feel quite disappointed by the Labour Party at large. I don't know if they're feeling that schools are like the worst bit of the whole thing, but without more shift on or leadership on special educational needs, and especially if the funding, I mean, if we get to a situation where the pay review body puts a number on the table and the government doesn't come up with that number, I can see that there's going to be problems, because that is kind of the point of an independent review body. You know, when the independent pay review says the MPs should get a pay rise, no one goes to the MPs and says, right, who are you going to fire to make that happen? You know, the money comes behind it. So I think if Labour want to at least keep people on board somewhere, they do have to come up with that funding. And overall at the moment, it's just been a little bit disappointing. There's not even a sort of an inkling of hope, but maybe when the curriculum review comes out, maybe as the special needs starts to move forwards, maybe they'll come up with some new ideas. But I think at the moment it's just feeling a bit flat and a bit disappointed. And that's a shame when people had higher hopes. And we do know from Teacher Tapp that most teachers vote Labour, or, you know, more than half are voting for the Labour Party. So there was a lot of goodwill shown towards the Labour Party. They'd like that back. And the final thing I'd say to Bridget Phillipson is there was a speech made earlier this year about Offstead in which I think she was overly critical of school leaders. Generally, she's given very good speeches. But the tenor of that one felt like she was telling off naughty children. And school leaders over the last 5 years have done extraordinary things. They have gone to extraordinary lengths. I mean, we have the data to prove the stress they were under, the difficulties they faced. The government largely didn't help them, and they did it with an enormous amount of determination, and I think they should hold their heads up high. So to come at them with any kind of speech which says you need to pull your socks up or we're kind of on top of you, it's like yelling at your year 11 class who've already put in 5 years and they're going to give you really good GCSE results. Like, now's not the moment. You need to put that differently. And so that would be my message to her, I think, if I was being super honest at this point in time.
And when it comes to Offstead, what do you think teachers want from this consultation, and what would they like to see happen to that body?
You know, Ofsted's a tough one, because when you survey people, the key question is to ask whether or not they believe it's the thing that can be done. We all spend a lot of time talking about Offstead, about how we should do it. But really, in their gut, do people believe that if you send a person to a school for a few days, they're going to be able to give you a score for that school that's reliable? And off the top of my head, I think it's more than half don't think that's possible. So it doesn't really matter about the rest of the conversation, because we're tinkering around the edges of, do I think this is an acceptable version of a thing that I don't really think can happen? And no matter what you put forwards, people are always going to find it slightly distasteful because they find the underlying concept slightly distasteful. So as a government, you have to make a decision. You either sort of decide you're not bothered if people find it distasteful in the profession because it's not for them, it's for the parents, it's for the government, it's for accountability, and you're not interested in what they have to say. Or you would have to do something completely different and either not have it which isn't going to happen because that will come across as soft on standards, or in fact could be soft on standards. You'd be saying to people, right, we're not checking on you anymore. Or you'd have to come up with something completely different, which would require changing the staffing and potentially be more expensive and be more risky, and you don't know how it's going to go. So I think whatever way anybody goes for Offstead, you're not bringing everybody with you. And I don't like that. I like a world where we all come along together and there's a great narrative, and I spend a lot of my time trying to explain where the government are coming from and make people feel positive about it, because it's better to kind of understand it from first principles, even if you disagree. But on this one, unfortunately, I think the great unspoken is that so many people do not in their heart of hearts believe that if a person turns up at their school, they can accurately grade it. But I do believe in it because of my own schooling. So I went to a school that eventually closed. It was not a great school. I think it could have gone on for a very, very long time being not great. But because we did have Offstead inspections and people came in from outside and challenged the standards, and when decisions were made to close the school in the mid-2000s, because there weren't many places available, our school was the one that was rightly closed. And that wouldn't have happened. I think there would have been generations more of children going to a school that wasn't very good without that external independent person looking at it. So my sympathies generally for a lot of years have lay with the idea of an inspectorate. But I increasingly also look at how difficult that is to do reliably and validly, how much impact that has on the leaders. And I question whether we've got to a point where things have tipped in the other direction. Same with SATs, funnily enough. I believed deeply in SATs, having come from a very mediocre area where people were allowed to do what they wanted. I think bringing SATs in did increase and improve standards for a long time. Have we got to a flip point where perhaps we overemphasize it and there's too much riding on it? Yeah, it's possible. And at those points, often stepping back is very hard. You almost have to start again. But I understand why politically, as with many other things in our society at the moment, that's just not possible.
And in all the tough headlines, sometimes the joy of teaching is lost. To remind people listening, what are some of the reasons that people say to you that they love teaching and why they choose to stay in the profession?
Well, I mean, on any given week, if we ask, did you enjoy your work? It's over 80% say yes. Are you proud of your work? Over 80% of people say yes. And I don't know, maybe that's true for other people. Maybe the accountants are going home thinking, what a great week at work. I'm sure some do think that. Please, any accountants listening, I'm sure that, you have a great time. But it is true that it's a great job. And when you ask why, like what made you smile this week, is the kids. They're very funny. We hear lots and lots of funny stories, and also their colleagues. They've got great people around them. One of my favorite stories was on Halloween. We asked about anything scary that had happened to you. And someone told us that assistant head had come in sort of white as a sheet saying there's a ghost in the corridor. And they'd gone to look on the school camera, and there on the CCTV did appear to be a ghost wandering through the corridor. And in fact, when they went down there, it was a cobweb that was on the camera. And they cleared that away.
They're ringing up ghost hunters like, we've got one.
And I love that. One of my other favourites we've asked about is what's the best excuses that kids give you for being late?
Oh, I love those.
Seagulls apparently come up a lot. And Greggs. I don't know what Greggs is doing, but people are waiting for
Greggs or
sausage rolls. They're waiting for sausage rolls from Greggs.
It is a long queue in there.
And then there's also the cute stuff, right? Like I think we asked once about what has someone done recently that was kind. And I remember that a kid was in a class where the teacher had, I think it was a box of badges. And this kid suddenly starts working super, super hard. And the teacher's thinking, wow, this kid really, really likes badges. And each time he dips his hand in, he's kind of getting a different out and he's getting a different out. And eventually he wins this monkey. And then he gives it to the teacher. And he said, I remembered that you like monkeys and I wanted to win it so that you could have it.
Oh, that's lovely.
And that's the sort of stuff that happens all the time when you teach, actually. The kids are weirdly lovely in sometimes the strangest of ways. And it makes you happy, thoughtful, reflective. And again, I am sure there are some people in other jobs who get to have that full range of emotions every week, but I don't think most people get to feel pride, joy, get a monkey badge, and find a ghost in a given week.
I love the summary of that. And looking ahead, what do you think gives you hope for the sector? And maybe one thing you think could change that would improve the daily lives of teachers?
The hope is always in the fact that it's a great job, and it just brings really great people in. There's nothing as wonderful in my year as when I get to go to the teaching awards. And every single person who wins a teaching award pretty much talks about their colleagues, thanks everybody, talks about the kids, talks about who they're doing it for. And, I go to awards in other sectors and it's not the same. It really isn't. It can be quite brutal. And teaching is a team game with lovely people who are there to do great things. The kids turn up and they've got one shot at this, and you are building the future. So the hope is in the fact that it's hopeful. In terms of teachers' daily lives, coming back to something we talked about earlier on registration, I think that AI and large language models and the change in technologies will enable us to think differently about certain bureaucratic parts of school. We can get into kind of lesson plans and resources and all the rest of it, but there's a load of guff in school that takes ages that should be sped up by technology. And one of those is registration. And I question whether 20 minutes every day in form time is a good use of teachers' time. Now, when you survey, about half of teachers love form time and they don't want to get rid of it. About half of them do. So as ever, anything you do in school is going to divide people. But that's just a simple thing. Like, is there a quicker way that people could register? Someone once said, why aren't we using kind of fingerprint monitors? Or even just, Amazon apparently knows when you've walked off with a pack of grapes. Like,
crazy.
Is there not a way that we can know whether or not a child is in school or out of school? Like, it feels as though that sort of technology could help. In fact, Mike Cameron, teacher blogger, wrote a great blog a number of years ago about all the tech that should be developed for schools. And he talked about the fact that voice activation when you're a teacher would really help, personalized to you, because you often don't have the ability to go and put the lights on or turn them off or otherwise. So I think there's stuff like that if we can get it right will mean that some of the admin disappears. And hopefully that will mean that you can focus more on the children, on the relationships and on the learning. Because when you ask people what their favourite bit of the job is, the vast majority pick being in the classroom with the kids. Not the lesson planning, not the marking, not the admin, not talking to parents, not being on duty. It is that moment of being in the lessons with the kids. And if we can do more of that because of technology, brilliant.
We like to finish the podcast with a quick fire, 4 rounds.
Uh-oh.
So get ready. So question number 1, what do you think is the biggest challenge facing the sector at this moment?
I think it is special educational needs. Schools work well about 80% of the time for about 80% of kids. And then they don't work well at all for about 20% of kids. And they don't work well some of the time for the other 80. And I think we're still not quite used to what we do with that, how much we spend on it, who is responsible for it, how do we make it work. We've made huge inroads compared to other countries sometimes and compared to where we were even 30 or 40 years ago. But I think we've still got some way to go. And we're also wanting to do it better. That's the biggest challenge.
Second question, what motivates you on difficult days?
A number of the pupils who I taught who had really, really difficult lives and every day came into my school and wanted to learn. And I used to think it then with teaching, and I still think it now. I'll think if they can get up every morning and come here and still be working, then by goodness, with everything and all the privileges and advantages I've got in life, then I think I should be able to do the same.
Third question, what has been your proudest achievement in your career so far?
I'd have said that award where the posset kind of
tainted the moment.
Yeah, it was the Teach First award. I won the Teach First teaching award, and it was really, really important. I think we also proudest achievement.
This is the one that everyone always struggles on.
Do you know why people struggle on this question? Because again, teachers and people in education really care about other people, and so there are things that might matter to you. But actually, in the scale of how much they mattered to other people, it's quite different. And I had a group who were a BTEC group who, when I got there, had not really been taught in year 12 to do their coursework. So we were miles and miles behind. And over that year, those kids came back on a Wednesday and stayed with me till 8 o'clock every single week. And at the end of the year, not only did they all go on and do brilliant things, lots of them have gone on and done great stuff since then. And so like my instinct is to say that, but that's not really my achievement, right? Like that's
Of course
their
that is,
achievement.
but you were
I'm
there with
proud
them.
of the fact that we put that extra effort in. They turned up. I've stayed in touch with lots of them, and they've gone on and done extraordinary things to the point that one of them was in the team. When I was taken into A&E with an anaphylactic shock, she was actually one of the nurses on the ward.
Oh, wow.
And I heard her voice over the intercom as I came round. And yeah, that was a great moment.
Oh.
So
in your worst moment, you were like, wow, that's insane.
And this kid that I had helped
Yeah.
get this qualification had then gone on to become a nurse. And she was crying and I was crying. My mum who knew her was crying.
That's amazing.
It was brilliant. So that's why it's hard though. It's always hard to answer that question because there are so many great things, so many great people, and those achievements are never your own in teaching, ever.
And final question, what are you looking forward to most this year?
So I think we've got an upcoming academic year where I'm always fascinated to see how changes are responding to. So we've always got things like the curriculum review that's ready to come out. I'll be fascinated, I think, to see how that plays out, how much workload is actually going to work, and whether or not we can make sure teachers' voices are represented in that. That's probably the thing I'm most interested in over the next 12 months.
Amazing. I think it's going to be an exciting year for education. There's going to be some big changes and big voices in the sector coming out. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. But that brings us to the end of the podcast, Laura. Thank you so much for coming on. I know you're super busy and in demand, so I really appreciate you taking the time to come and speak to us. And I know the listeners are going to take so much away from this. And I also just want to say thank you for everything you do for the sector and for representing teachers who, like you say, work so hard. And it's amazing that someone like you is there to raise their voices and lift them.
Thank you. And thanks to the teachers who do it right, because at the end of the day, I'm not in the classroom anymore. I'm really aware of that fact. And if they weren't spending the time to share their voices, then there'd be no way we could do it. So appreciate you giving us this chance as well. Thanks very much.
That brings us to the end of this episode, and what a thought-provoking conversation it's been. Laura has painted a picture of where the sector stands today, and she's offered rare insight into the daily realities behind the data. She's reminded us that behind every headline and statistic are real people, managing real pressures, finding moments of joy, and doing work that truly matters. A huge thank you to Laura for joining us today and sharing so openly. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with your team and like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.